for me, I remember it as the end of that. It's only ever happened once, one time in my life. You know, people talk about having like eureka moments.
Mm.
Classically in the bath. Well, I wasn't in the
Yeah.
bath. I was in a hotel room in Castelbrando, and I was lying in bed thinking about the course of the day, and honestly, it sounds bizarre, but it was like there was like a bing, like almost like a glass shattering moment, and I suddenly just, what if we're doing it all wrong? What if we build what rather than solve the problem of evolving the big things? Why do we solve for
Yeah.
that and build smaller things?
Yeah.
And I remember running down to breakfast the next morning, and Jimmy Nielsen was there with his lovely wife, and the kids were there. And I went running, they were literally just leaving. And I ran, Jimmy, 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 Jimmy. And I was just sort of blabbering at Jimmy. He was looking at me in his incredibly calm, slightly quizzical kind of manner at this exuberant Welshman suddenly running up to him, kind of, I've got it, I've got this idea. And really, it sort of came from there for me. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, as I've said many times, there was sort of parallel evolution, convergent evolution in these things. So,
Yeah.
we had Dan North talking about replaceable component architectures. Fred George was in his programmer anarchy stage, and he was talking
Yeah.
about all the tiny services.
Yeah.
Um, we had Adrian Cockcroft, obviously at Netflix. He was talking about fine-grained service-oriented architectures at
Yeah.
scale. They were building stuff at scale at Netflix at the time. And so I think it was just a set of ideas whose time had come, if you like.
Yeah.
To be honest, there's, and of course everyone knows each other anyway, right? Daniel's
Yeah.
ex ThoughtWorks, Fred George's ex ThoughtWorks, Adrian Cockcroft is big mates with Jim and Ian
Yeah.
from integration from circles. So
Yeah.
there's a group of people whose ideas are
Yeah.
circulating, and I think the time had really arrived when it was possible to do all the things.
Yeah.
So, I talk about XP being, well, I don't, XP is doing all the things and turning it up to 11. I think microservices is similar to that. And
Mm.
without being able to do things like, spin up environments automatically, which you can do with the cloud, because obviously AWS was starting to become, moving into the ascendancy. Um, I don't think, I think that the complexity which you push into the infrastructure wouldn't have been worth it
Hmm.
until until about that point. Um, so I'm sure many other people had lots of these ideas beforehand. You could argue that Alan Kay, when he talks about object
Yeah.
orientation as, what does he say? Message. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
Message passing, encapsulation, and extreme
I,
layer.
I did something in the early 90s. I worked for a startup. There was a guy that worked in IBM, and he came up with a concept for what he called cooperative business objects.
Yeah,
And we built I worked in this startup that built the infrastructure to support these cooperative business objects. So essentially, to a very large extent, separating the essential complexity of the system from the accidental complexity, and you built the system from a series of these things. We got a bunch of things right. We invented XML before XML was a thing, in order to make it to make
yeah,
the kind of communication, so you could have flexible communications, and it did some really cool things. I think we also got a bunch of things wrong, but we had we had a programming model for building systems in COBOL, very very object oriented systems in COBOL, which was interesting. And a bunch of other languages too. It was really fascinating, and that got me really interested in kind of service-based design ideas.
yeah.
Then I think, and one of the things that's always surprised me is that I can't think of any programming language or system that really surfaces the idea of a service. And that seems weird because it seems like such a broad, natural
Mm,
division of responsibility in design.
mm.
But every time I've ever done it, and that's nearly every system that I've built since the 1990s, it's you have to come up with your own conventions and protocols for what you mean by the edge of a service, and
Yeah,
that seems a bit strange.
it does. I guess you could argue that Erlang came as came closest.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, that's true.
which is essentially probably you could argue the most true to Alan
Yeah,
Kay's idea of object orientation.
yeah,
I think Daniel Tillis North again. He's got a quote about one of his quotes. It's the Greenspan's 10th law.
yeah,
Where it's the Greenspan's 10th law is any sufficiently complicated, paraphrasing, sufficiently complicated object-oriented system will contain a half implemented bug-ridden version of half of Common Lisp, right? And I
yeah,
think you replace those with microservices and Erlang, right? So any
yeah,
sufficiently
yeah,
complicated microservices implementation
yeah.
contains a half-assed bug-ridden implementation of half of Erlang. Um, exactly. I mean, I fully agree. And when I joined Thoughtworks, I worked at several investment banks, and it was quite natural when you're sitting working with traders to build lots of small things.
Yeah.
Because you haven't got time not to build lots of small things,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And, do you mind if I just take a week? Because yes, you
yeah,
can have that, but I'm going to take a week
yeah,
to change this first, and it's going to take. You can't do that if you've got an
yeah,
opportunity in 3 days' time. So
yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then Martin came to visit a project I was working on, and B and Martin did his. Oh, this seems like an interesting idea. You should write an article for my website. Blah 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 blah. Um, that was in 2012, I think, or 2011. And then it took me 3 years, and he invited me to like a sleepover in his house in Boston, and I eventually we eventually wrote it up in 2014. So yeah, but
So he
that,
kidnapped you to write the article.
basically it's the only way. I mean, I was laughing about this with Eric, Eric Tinnenberg, obviously a mutual friend
Yeah,
of ours. And I was saying it's terrible. I find writing difficult. Really, I enjoy it. I
mm,
find it difficult to get
yeah,
started. And he said, "Well, it turns out you're quite good at communicating in other ways. You're quite good on stage. You're quite good at interviewing people and things like that. So I guess we don't all have to be the same, do we?" So
no. Probably good if we're not, because everybody'd have a YouTube channel.
yeah. I'm just like to say, I'm launching my. I'm actually on Twitch every night, Dave. That's
that's why. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So semantic diffusion's a thing. Everybody that I know of that's come up with an idea that's become popular, kind of, at least subvocally says, "I didn't mean that." So what things do you wish that people more understood about microservices, or that they missed?
That's a really good question. So I came up with this really catchy term which never caught on, right? Not microservices. That was a kind of group effort, and then when it appeared on Martin's site, that's it, right? You're done because it stays
Yeah, yeah,
named then on Martin's
yeah.
site. But no, I came up with this idea of I think it was called the microservices integration pattern organizational onion. Which, as I say, not a great name.
It's not quite as catchy, is it?
It's not. It's not. And it was when I was talking about Common's law a lot. I did a series of talks on Common's law. Why I learned to stop worrying and embrace Common's law and so on. And one of the things I talked about in that is much like I see functions and methods, objects, microservices, and then collections of these things as it's like you start at the macro, and then as you get deeper and deeper, it's kind of fractal. The same structure repeats itself until you get down to the methods and the class or whatever, right? So I sort of see it as this the turtles all the way down until you hit the VM. That's what it's all sitting on, or the OS. And in my mind, when you sort of chunk up from the smaller things to the bigger things, you chunk up from the method to the class to the library or the namespace to a service into groups of collaborating services, and then in my mind, the whole thing was about how teams are organized around those as well. So that there is a similar structure, a similar fractal nature to the organizations building these things.
Yeah.
So as you chunk up to larger organizational units, if it's a team of people, then who are managing a number of services, maybe whatever that's 5, 6, whatever it is, 10, that's from the outside is opaque. You don't need to know, you know.
Yeah.
And as you have these groups of teams collaborating via these external service interfaces, I think that the trendy phrase is, hard on the outside, soft in the middle, right? So,
Yeah.
the domain boundaries are very clear, defined by, as you were saying,
Yeah.
very clear application protocols that we don't have to invent every time. We use
Yeah.
standard ones like the web ones, W3C standards,
Yeah.
to talk to one another. And then those teams are then chunked up again into a number of teams implementing a business capability.
Yeah.
So, and I think the idea of the business capability was the thing that we didn't quite get across. So I think people say business capability is synonymous with a bounded context, or somewhat synonymous with some of the domain-driven design, when they're not, because business capabilities tend to be big, fairly big things to first order. If zeroth order, they're massive, but first order, they're sort of warehouse management. There's a lot going on in warehouse management, and only some of it is software.
Yeah.
That's the key thing. There's people, there's the processes those people are following, there's the tools that they're using to do their work. And, so if you're talking about microservices organized around business capabilities, there's a set of microservices organized around warehouse management, right?
Yeah.
Which are some of those tools.
Yeah.
And I think that's led, I don't know if it's definitely correlation between a sort of misunderstanding of that and this sort of fractal nature, and how they should be completely decoupled across these big capabilities.
Yes.
And the fractal nature of them inside, to this microservice soup thing, anti-pattern, which you see a lot of, right? Which is, you've got, I've got 2,000 microservices and I have to deploy them all at once. Microservices are rubbish. Like, well, that is what we never said do that, right?
2,000 microservices and 10 developers. Yeah.
10 developers, 2,000 microservices, and we can only deploy them every 2 years because we've got 8 months of progression. You're not winning at anything if you've ended up there. So I think that is one of the things I wish we'd spent more time talking about.
This clip was taken from my podcast, The Engineering Room with Dave Farley, a monthly podcast with some of the brightest minds in software engineering. You can find full episodes on all your favourite podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts and Amazon Music. Your support helps us to bring you these regular episodes, so please leave your positive review on your preferred podcast platform to help us to continue to grow and bring you great guests and their insights. Thank you very much for listening.